afternoon. Welcome to Senate Education. It's Tuesday, May 2nd, 1:49. Mr. O'Grady, thanks for joining us. We are trying to encourage our federal delegation. We sent them a letter a while back on school construction firms. Now we're trying to get them to encourage the EPA to look at this, the setting, the standard for PCBs. And we know that the EPA historically, we've heard, has not been great at, or I'd say the federal government in general has not been great at dealing with chemicals of high concern. I can just speak to my own experience with PFAS and certainly your experience with PFAS and other chemicals. What we're asking our delegation to do is to encourage them to look at that, push the EPA to look at that standard. And I would say it's really what we're trying to get them to talk about is the airborne standard. And I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that, but
Because they don't have an air quality standard, do they, from my understanding?
I think so.
They don't have a mandate, so what they have is for schools.
Yeah.
And so they're called EELs, but effectively exposure levels for evaluation.
Yeah.
And their recommendations. They have this little flow chart that schools are supposed to do. You know, if you were built before 1979, your building may contain building materials. And then it gets to this big gray box right here. It's where it said, you might want to do indoor air testing.
This is the federal.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it's a recommendation.
Yeah.
It's not a requirement. And then it goes on and says, if you hit one of the ELEs, not ELs, then you evaluate what you're going to do. And maybe you put in some mitigation measures, maybe you do some more testing. And if you're over 50 parts per million, then you have to take the stuff out of the building. But the 50 parts per million is really focused on the building material, demolition waste or construction waste. And so that's significantly higher,
Right.
first of all, because it's in a parts per million versus the NAV grams per milliliter, right?
Oh,
Cubic. So yes, I mean you're there's a significant gap between this mandatory action and their ELE.
Have you seen these kinds of gaps before?
Well, I
mean, remind me of PFAS, but they started.
yes, I mean PFAS started at a very, very high level, but the new PFAS standard, which has not been fully formalized and ruled yet, will be below Vermont's current standard because of the concern and the prevalence of those chemicals, that they're effectively everywhere.
How did they get to that? I mean, can you just give us some? So when we started the PFAS conversation, feds had, really high, not high standards, low standards in terms of PFAS, and now they're below, or they're so much more stringent than Vermont. Not so much more, but they're more stringent.
They will be more stringent, right? The history of chemical regulation is it's long and it's a little ugly. The major law governing is called TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, and it's not based on a precautionary system. It's based on you effectively get approved if you meet certain minor hurdles, and then there's an approval for use, and then there was basically, if something happened, then it would be reviewed. And so a lot of chemicals got out for use without a lot of significant review. And the review was usually based on the evaluations and studies made by the manufacturer, but they weren't necessarily independent. TSCA was amended about 4 years ago now to build in a more precautionary component and to have mandates for EPA to review the health and safety of a certain number of chemicals per year. It's going okay, but there are thousands of chemicals, and the chemical is allowed for its use until EPA brings it in for review and makes a determination on its safety and efficacy. What's problematic to an extent about that EPA review, it sounds great. At least they're reviewing, at least they have a mandate to review a certain number each year. But once a chemical is in review, the states are preempted from regulating. And so states are otherwise can adopt their own regulations of these chemicals, but once it's in that EPA review, it's basically that regulation is kind of forestalled. So it makes it somewhat, I won't say it's a risky act to try to regulate a chemical. It's just that you're potentially your state regulation will not be valid for a period of time while it's under review.
Like, what's the period of time usually?
Oh, I'd have to go back and look at my summary. It's called the Frank-Lautenberg Act. I have to go back and look at that.
But like a couple of years or like a couple decades, or somewhere in
Good
between.
question.
I think I have to go back. I haven't looked at that. I have a fact sheet on it that I did that I can give you all. But that federal law interplays with other states that are regulating. California has what is originally called the green chemistry rules, where they've identified chemicals that they believe are dangerous or toxic. And once they've identified it as dangerous or toxic, the manufacturer of a product with it has to label it as. California has found that this has been.
That's right.
We open up a string of Christmas lights and there's like a little label on it that says the California's found the coating to be potentially harmful.
I just bought this. There was one on Friday.
Yeah. So the states are making efforts that are more precautionary, I would say, than EPA. But EPA is also making improvements to TSCA, not necessarily. It's not saying like the EU standard, where EU, you basically have to prove that it's safe, and it goes through years of review, and then the ROS, the standards, where you don't get to be used if you're found to not be in compliance. It's a more precautionary approach, but it takes time and it takes money to navigate.
So I know you can't predict this, but I guess if you were to have the administration in right now and say, hey, should we move in this direction? They might say there's some risk, because if it does come under review, it could be a long time before the state can then.
So right now, you say the current testing program and the action levels that have been set up for that, they're not that significantly different from EPA. I mean, they are lower, but I think Commissioner Levine, he did a side-by-side what they are. You know, the screening level, EPA screening level is actually lower than Vermont's. It's more protective, but the action level in Vermont is much more protective. And then the immediate action level is also much more protective. And Vermont's action level depends on the age of the exposed population, the duration of exposure, et cetera. And EPA has some of that too. They have, theirs is kind of based on age, not necessarily duration of exposure, but so I guess my question is A, that you would want EPA to revise its standards for PCB exposure. Is it just in schools or is it in all indoor air quality?
I'm inclined to say all indoor air quality and have the natural resource and energy look at it also.
Okay. Because there are other entities that regulate PCB exposure levels, like OSHA. Okay. So in the workplace, the occupation OSHA has a time-weighted average, an airborne concentration of 1 milligram per cubic meter for PCBs containing 42% chlorine. And then the exposure level for PCBs with 54% chlorine and an average molecular formula is a different standard. They don't actually spell it out here, but, and then NIOSH also has standards. NIOSH is the National Institute on Occupational Safety and Health. And they have a separate standard for workplace. So there are other standards that are adopted by other entities. NIOSH's standard is a narrative standard. They recommend that any exposure be reduced to the lowest possible exposure.
What does that stand for again? NIOSH?
National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health.
And they're all lower than the EPA. They're more stringent than the EPA.
Well, the OSHA standard with the 1 can be. So I think really what you're asking for is to have a mandatory exposure levels in schools, indoor air quality in schools, that is more protective of school populations than their current recommended levels. And then the question is, do you think that they should mandate testing in schools?
At the federal level.
Yes. Mandate and pay.
That's key. I like that idea. Yeah, for sure. Do you mind drafting something to the effect of what you just said, more stringent with financing? Again, we could re-emphasize, when you look at our school construction letter, and perhaps re-emphasize the need for funds going forward with just general school construction. But yeah, and then we can take a look at it over the next couple of days, and I can run it by the chairs of health and welfare.
Sure.
So I guess,
Yeah, please.
so in S25, PFAS,
Yeah.
we set a tougher standard than even California. So does that mean that the federal government isn't testing, hasn't set a standard for PFAS?
So the federal government came out, it's almost 18 months ago now, with what they're calling the PFAS roadmap. And so they've identified their major media areas that they regulate in: air, water, waste, toxic substances. And they're proposing standards for PFAS standards for each of those 4 major categories. That they've recently proposed taking some PFAS off of the approved list under TSCA. And they are proposing water quality standards, drinking water standards, solid waste management standards, but those standards won't become enforceable until they're enacted as rule. And so that's their next step. And they have what they call roadmap. They have a roadmap to getting there. But it also depends on who's in the administration at the time when rulemaking is right. Because for prior transitions, some rules just are just put aside and don't go forward. But I think that rule, or at least some of those rules, because of the pressure from states and the prevalence of PFAS contamination, it's coast to coast. It's everywhere that you can think of it. Water, soil, waste, that there will likely be state pressure for them to continue with these components of those rules. And Vermont had its own PFAS bill a few years ago that directed A&R to come up with a drinking water standard, which they have, come up with a hazardous waste standard, which they have, and to come up with a water quality standard, which they have not done yet because they wanted it to be consistent, if not with EPA, but regionally with New England states. And that's going to be a tougher one to do because that is about how, because you don't really know all of the sources of PFAS. Just take Bennington, for example. There's probably PFAS leaching from soil into groundwater reaches surface water, and then that's in your surface water, and how do you account for that in a water quality standard? It's just there leaching into groundwater, which is leaching into surface water. And how do you manage that? I don't know.
Is there a chemical that's as ubiquitous as PFAS? I mean, it is everywhere, right? I mean,
there are many chemicals that are as ubiquitous as PFAS. I will say that manufacturers are becoming more aware of what they're using and not just trying to reach an end result, but being precautionary, using some systems that have been enacted, ISO systems, blue sign, things like that, that are management techniques for what you're going to put in your product, and how it's going to be ultimately handled. But there's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of chemicals that are approved for use, and some of them, the full effect is not known.
That's a sad note to end on. But to Notter's point, we talked about school construction, like, we gotta make sure we're building new schools or renovating that we're not using chemicals that we don't understand yet.
Well, that I think one of the industries that it was first impacted by chemical management is the construction industry, because PCBs were in a ton of things, lamps, caulk, paint, and they had to pivot away from those, and they had to move towards materials that were better. But you pivot from one thing into another. There are entities that certify some building materials as being safer than others. But I don't know if they can really guarantee that they are safe. All right, I will start a letter.
thanks.
Do you want it to be addressed to the federal delegation specifically, then CC, say, Commissioner Levine, Secretary Moore, Governor Philbrook?
Speaker.
Okay, all right. Will do.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Right. Do you know who the contact at EPA would be? Have you talked to anyone at EPA on this?
The only person I've talked to or had any correspondence with Judith Eng, who used to be in this district.
Okay. I
I
will,
can reach out to Judith and find out.
all my EPA contacts are dead or retiring, so
All right.
I will have to figure who that app is.
All right, I need to run up. We'll pick up at 2:30. If anybody wants to go meet the folks from the higher education consortium,